might sound odd for us in this room today, but one of the biggest fights that Unitarians were having amongst each other in the early 1800s, and one that kind of changed the course of what progressive religion looks like in the United States forever, was a fight that they were having about miracles. In the early part of the 19th century, I'm assuming that you don't leave church and go to brunch and argue about the nature and existence of miracles, but they did. And so there was a big fight happening in New England at the time, and part of the camp said, well, these simply must be symbolic stories, not supernatural moments that broke into the world. They must be symbols pulling us toward a relationship with God. Another camp said, well, no, they must have actually happened just the way it's said, because God intended to wake people up through these radical actions of entering the world, and now that all of those are done with, we don't expect any more to ever happen, and we will just pursue our religious lives from a symbolic and what they would have called rational way of being. And then some others who were somewhere in the middle. Now, for you and me, this is probably not a deal breaker, but for them it was. And they fought, and the way that you fought, if you were a self-righteous New England Unitarian in the 1800s, was you wrote a pamphlet and published it and passed them out all over Boston. And you called other people really bad names and said they were wrong. And that's what they did. They had pamphlet wars over these kinds of things. That's what they were called. And into this great argument about how new truth is being injected into the world. So that's what it was actually about. Did things we can't understand used to happen? Or can we still not understand what's happening? That's really the argument they were having. And into this came one of our patron saints, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Oh, right. Don't you love that content? Like, he would love that so much. Him especially. In 1838, he showed up at Harvard Divinity School. He was invited to give the graduation address for the seminarians there. And it would have been a room, it is a room, kind of 2 or 3 times the size of this chancel. It was a hot July day. They were in stuffy robes, kind of like these. And there were a couple dozen graduates, and he was speaking to them and their families. And he started off, as most successful speeches do, by telling everyone that they were wrong. What he told them was that the Unitarian churches of his day were what he called corpse cold. Corpse cold. This is not exciting. I'm not getting anything out of it. It's not very valuable. And it's because, he said, you all are arguing over nonsense. Half of you are in a room somewhere isolated arguing that miracles don't exist. The other half of you are arguing with those people to say that they do. And while you're arguing, miracles are happening. The rain is falling. The grass is growing. Your heart is beating. You're missing miracles because you're talking about miracles. He also said, and this got a bigger reaction, that the church of this day had what he called a noxious obsession with the person of Jesus. They were also fighting about what Jesus was like. Fully human, kind of superhuman, somewhere in between. And he said, this is a ridiculous fight. It doesn't do anything for your life. His main claim in that room was, once you get that you are a child of God, then things will change. Then you'll get it, that you have a direct relationship with the holy, creative source of all existence. Just like Jesus, just like the prophets Muhammad or Buddha, just like every saint or sinner that we've heard of. You are standing in the same stream. He said it was wrong to say that God spoke instead of to say that God speaks. And he challenged everyone in the room to cast beside you all conformity and acquaint yourself at first hand with deity. Basically, it's nice that you read it in a book. Wouldn't you like to actually experience it for yourself? Or as Barbara Bound Taylor says, some people like to read the menu and other people like to eat. Emerson was encouraging people to eat. At the end, he took some time to criticize the preaching of a well-known preacher in town, which always goes over well. And it went over so well that they asked him not to come back for a couple decades. But somebody important was, a lot of important people were in the room, but an especially important person sitting in the back was a young recent graduate of the divinity school named Theodore Parker. Those of you who don't know Parker, he wrote the words, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." He's the person who said a government by the people, for the people, of the people. He was one of the first megachurch preachers in the United States, having thousands of people at his church called the 28th Congregationalist Society of Boston, before microphones. But on that day, he was a young 20-something graduate of the divinity school who was pastoring a very small church in Roxbury, Massachusetts. And he went home and he wrote in his journal, went to worship, went to a religious education committee meeting, went and visited somebody at the hospital. See, nothing has changed. And then he said, then I went and saw Mr. Emerson speak, and now everything has to change. I have to finally say the things I've been thinking but not saying for a long time. What he was thinking and not saying was that progressive religion had to change or die. He preached a sermon a few years later called The Transient and Permanent in Christianity. And basically what he said was, in a progressive faith, we're talking us, you must always, at all times, be willing to discard, throw away, burn, rip up everything that is not essential to faith. There are permanent things, he said, and transient things. Really, the only permanent thing, he said, was the love of God and humans' direct ability to experience it. What he called pure religion. Transient things were everything that you and I care about. How we worship, the order of service, where the organ is, how we move the piano, robes and stoles, hymnals. And then he started getting around to the stuff that actually got people upset. So you play the role of the upset congregation, and I'll play the role of Mr. Parker. So he said, every generation has thought that they finally got it right in church. And then we realized that they didn't, and so you're wrong too. No, wait. That's not the permanent. The permanent is the direct relationship with God, and we've determined through scriptural study that the apostles themselves made mistakes and were also wrong, and so we can't always trust what the Bible says. Now wait. He also then went on to say at the end, pure religion, God's presence in the world and the availability for every single person to directly experience a connection with the divine mystery itself was so strong that if Jesus himself had never been born, it would still have made its way into the world. And then he ended this successful sermon by saying, I see a lot of my colleagues in the room, and I know that a lot of you secretly agree with me, because you've told me that you do, and you don't tell your parishioners. And he said, it's great if you want to do that, but alas for the person who believes one thing in their closet and preaches another in the pulpit. God will forgive you, but what we should do is write over your study in your pulpit the word emptiness, and on your forehead, deceit. They had a similar reaction. And it so upset them that they tried to excommunicate him. But you can't excommunicate a Unitarian. There's no function for that. And so, and this is true, I'm paraphrasing a little bit for time, they had meetings for like 2 years of very angry, older, white Unitarian Bostonians in a room. What are we going to do about Mr. Parker? And their final answer, the only thing they could do, will be mean to him. Literally, we will stop inviting him over. Because they just couldn't do much else. And a number of years, he was one of the most prominent preachers in America, being quoted by presidents and senators. He funded personally John Brown, the radical abolitionist who took up arms against the U.S. government in opposition of slavery. He died before the Civil War and never saw any of his work come to fruition in that regard. And he would be shocked if he found out that he was required syllabus reading in Unitarian seminaries. The big point of that argument that chose a fork in the road in progressive faith was, what do we do with new experience and information? Do we fear it? Do we embrace it with awe? What do we do with what we don't know? How do we deal with not being able to know or do everything? Me, I deal with it very poorly. I get angry or shameful. I otherize other people. They're wrong because I don't understand them. That's a good one. But the primary question was, are you willing to receive new information about what it means to be human? You get to take door number 1 or door number 2. Progressive religion chose door number 2. That's the be willing to be open about the information of being a human door. But it was all perspective. To them, it mattered greatly what they knew and what they didn't. Now, they were all alive before we had the capacity to know what we know now about what it means to be human and how small we really are. Do you know the pale blue dot image? If we can show that on the screens, please. This is a picture of the planet Earth from 3.7 billion miles away, with a B. A picture of our planet, our home, from 3.7 billion miles. Do you see us? If you can't, we have a little circle for you. That's you, and me, and everybody. Carl Sagan, the cosmologist and prophet, wrote something to the effect of, that's where everything you've ever heard of happened. Every great war, every religion, every couple in love, every couple that's not, every battle, every act of kindness, every murder, every great story and poem, everything you've ever heard about that happened on a little piece of dust floating in a ray of light in a sea of infinity. And there are trillions of other pieces of dust also floating in that sea of infinity. Carl Sagan's response was to say, well, maybe we shouldn't take ourselves so seriously. Think of the rivers of blood, he said, that have been spilled by generals and soldiers so they could control a tiny portion of that piece of dust. Think of how we hate people who disagree with us on that tiny piece of dust. Think of the time wasted when we could have shown compassion and care on that tiny piece of dust. For Carl Sagan, that information about what we don't know has implications. And so when we ask the question this year, what does it mean to be a progressive faith in this moment, in this time, we have to know that every great religion that's ever been created, every scripture, every myth, every poem was created before they had the capacity to leave the earth and look back at that. Every great religion, every great philosophy, every myth that has overtaken the world was created prior to our ability to end human life on that piece of dust. Do we have the resources to be a religion for people who live right there? Are we willing to be a religion robust enough to give hope and comfort and challenge and justice to the people that live right there? That's the crux of a progressive faith. That's one of the primary tensions we deal with. How do we build a way of being together that acknowledges how little we are, and at the same time acknowledges the realities of human suffering and joy. How do we do that? To say that we are so small and there's so much we don't know, and to know that for the people who live on that rock, our lives matter. Our suffering matters. Our joys and pains matter. Our illnesses and bodies matter. We ache, we love, we dream, all on that little piece of dust. The tension between having profound humility and profound purpose, that's where we live in this church. The world can seem fragile today in ways that feel new to me. And our calling, not just this year, but as a group of people, is to form a church that has something relevant to say to people who live in this world. No other. Back in the old days, when people were defining liberal religion or progressive faith, they said that it was rooted in three things: freedom, reason, and tolerance. Those were the big branches of liberal religion: reason, freedom, and tolerance, which are good. Use your critical mind. You can't compel anyone to do or think something they don't think. And we must include a broad diversity of individuals in our walls. That's good. But reason, freedom, and tolerance will not do it alone. Because taken to their nth degree, reason, freedom, and tolerance means I'm smart, leave me alone, and nothing bad will happen to you. A religion that exists after we know that we have the capacity to end life on earth, at least for us. A religion for people who have left the planet and looked back and seen that has to be more than about being able to use your brain and be left alone. If we are going to be a faith for that planet, I believe we have to be rooted in profound humility, realistic hope, and active love and justice. Profound humility says there is so much we don't know, and that's okay. Profound humility says that we are not the center of the universe, not as humans, and certainly not as Unitarians. That we don't come here so that we can already be around the people who get it. That we come here so that we can be reminded of all that we don't know, and that that's a good thing. Profound humility says that there is always something possible breaking into the world that we don't even know about yet. That there's something about yourself that you don't know. That there's something about the people sitting next to you in the pews that you don't know, or the person you despise. There's something about them you also don't know. Profound humility is met with realistic hope. If the narrative that we told in this church was things used to be good in Eden and they're getting worse until we're raptured, it wouldn't mean that we had a lot to do. But in our congregation, the narrative isn't one of decay, it's one of evolution. That doesn't mean things get better on their own. It just means things can always change. And so for us, realistic hope has to be grounded in the notion that if we work together, even in the most dire of circumstances, meaningful change is always possible. That there is not a moment or a place where you cannot be kind. There is not a moment or a place where you cannot work to move the arc of the universe a little closer to justice. And it means that when we show up in the world, people should recognize us as a hopeful people. Not just empty, angry progressives at another rally. When we show up, they should say, those are the people who believe that a better world is possible. And I can tell by the way they act. I want to be in their presence because I want to be more hopeful too. And finally, a religious faith that is progressive and relevant in this time will be grounded in acts of love and justice. This is the hardest one because it's the one that you and I actually have to do something about. Acts of love and justice mean that in a progressive faith, there's no vicarious atonement. Do you know what that means? It's the religious term meaning in the moral realm, nobody else's work or sacrifice can do your work for you. So what that means is every time you say the phrase, I wish my church was more X, I wish my faith was more Y, I wish my city was more this, I wish my family was more that, someone's going to say, what a wonderful vision. What are you doing? You. And it means that people are going to judge whether we are who we say we are by how we behave. Not our ideas, not what the sign outside the church says, but how you, treat the people who come into this place and in the world. We have been a progressive center of religion in this city since 1899. We were started by a community of progressive Jews, Temple Emmanuel, who gave us the money and building to start our church. And we have weathered good times and bad. This church has had moments when it almost shut its doors because of a lack of money or will, but we stayed true. We have seen this country through wars, through moments of incredible social progress and moments of great oppression and evil. But we are here, we are still here because of the dedication and generosity of people like you. I know that I am still relatively young, but the world today and the environment we face and the country we're in feels to me more fraught and fragile than I've ever seen it. With storms the size of monsters moving across the earth and humans changing the very climate of the planet we call home. With a political system in our country that has us so polarized and hateful against one another that I can feel it in my own heart. It feels like things could fall apart. So do we have something to offer this moment? I think so. I think so. I am not naive or egotistical enough to believe that we are the saviors of the world. But we have a role to play. Do you believe that there's more to be known than can ever be known, and that's okay? Do you believe that it's worthwhile to teach our children to love their bodies and diversity so that we don't harm our bodies or others? Do you believe that if we live on that little speck of dust, we had better take care of it because we are all in this together? Do you believe that even in the worst of circumstances, something good is possible if we work together? Do you believe that the powers of love and justice are stronger than hatred or bigotry or fear? Then you have work to do. Welcome to this progressive congregation. Amen.